Hello and welcome to another recording of the Content Marketing Studio. Let me remind you that in this series, we look at ways you can create better online content faster to help you improve your online reputation and drive sales for your business. Today, I am joined by creative director and consultant Nash Mayuela. She's the founder of Podcastmate, and with her team, they are on a mission to help brands create audio stories and conversations that inspire their audiences to take action. Nash, a warm welcome to the Content Marketing Studio.
Thanks very much for having me, Pascal.
Now, you are also one of the few international guests I've had on the show. You know, the number of international guests is increasing all the time. So for me, it's the start of the day, but for you, it's the end of the day.
It is. It's around 4 p.m. where I am.
So where are you joining me from?
I am currently in Chiang Mai in Thailand, north of Thailand.
And have you always been based in Thailand?
Not exactly, but because of the pandemic, I'm kind of like stuck here in a good way, I guess. I mean, life is good here, so I'm okay with that.
So we're going to be talking about podcast productions. We're going to talk about audio stories. It's going to be a great conversation to either help someone who is thinking about podcasting for the first time, or people have been doing it for a while and looking for what next step's going to look like. And I want to start with you, if you don't mind, and ask you the question, which is, why podcast? Why the passion for audio production, which comes very clearly from the website, the marketing, the conversation we've had. Is it recent or something that's been with you for a while?
I don't know where to start, but I think I got attracted into podcast when I usually ride around with my bicycle and I listen to music, but I'm like, this is not enough for me anymore. And so I noticed one of my friends, she was listening to podcasts, and that's how I knew about podcast. And then I realized, I knew about podcasts, and then I was like, wow, there's so many content that I actually can consume. And this is a way for me to be able to maximize my time. So when I'm riding around the city and listening to podcasts, this is perfect because I feel like it's talking to me, or it's like a trusted friend, like a mentor talking to me. And it's different than just watching a video. It's more intimate. And that's what I like about it.
I would agree. I mean, people who follow the series know that I am a video producer at heart. Now, video is my thing. But when I've just started think of myself as a podcast producer for the last 2 years, give or take. And there is definitely a difference, and I welcome it. But in terms of what you're saying as well, the consumption of audio content, it's so much easier. You could be cycling. I have this image of you cycling somewhere, very exotic. You could be cooking, you could be driving a car. Whereas video, you need to just stop what you're doing and watch it. And that's been just fascinating for me to see the difference. There are similarities in how you produce, but there are very, very big differences in how it's consumed.
Yeah, I completely agree with this. I feel like for me, when I try to learn something, depending on what I'm trying to learn. But for example, if it's about lately, I've been obsessed about learning stuff about leadership, of course, and entrepreneurship, stuff like that. When I'm watching a video, it's demanding, and it demands me to sit and just look at this person the entire time. I'm like, and it doesn't really allow me to use my imagination and to connect the dots. But when I'm listening to audio and this person talking about leadership, I can fully experience everything. And I can really feel this person actually knows what he's talking about, because there's a certain command in the voice, and it commands a certain respect and authority that I don't really get. I don't know, but I have a bias for audio. So I guess that's why I feel that way. And also it's more about giving me this space where there's a space between this person talking to me or sharing me about something that I'm trying to learn and me consuming it. There's a space between that where I can use my imagination so that it can really permeate in my system, and then it sinks in and I'm able to retain what I just recently learned.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. So can I ask maybe two questions in one? How did you make the transition from being a consumer of audio content to being a producer and launching Podcastmate? And what did you do before? I mean, were you a creator, but did you use different medium?
No, not at all. I used to work as a business development consultant and marketing consultant. I work with tech startups online. So I'm in the SaaS space. I help startup founders come up with marketing strategies or set up partnerships with other startups. And it was during the pandemic where I did a huge shift. So around, I'm a rock climber. So at that time, in February, I was in Laos. I was on a rock climbing trip. And then this was in Laos, but Thailand was almost closing the border. So I was like rushing in, coming back to Thailand because there's a much better place to, get locked down. So my friend who's based in the US, she was like, let's kind of like work on Podcastmate again. We started this project in 2019 just for fun because we both loved podcast. And at that time, we were on lockdown. I had like 2 clients. I was working from an outdoor magazine. And also I was working for another tech startups. But it wasn't enough to keep me occupied because I'm kind of like an outdoor person. Like, okay, what else am I going to do to stay sane? And so we started this Podcastmate. And initially, the idea was just to be a show notes writing service provider for podcasters. But then we was like, no, let's become like a full-on production company. Because that way, when clients come to us, we can, really deliver a full service and they don't have to look anywhere. So that's kind of the idea. One of because we had another partner who he was a DJ for like, I guess, 20 years. So he was the one who's assigned in the tech side and stuff. So it's like, okay, we're complete. Let's like get it going. So that was kind of like how it came about.
It's fascinating, whilst the pandemic has been really trying and taxing, for all of us, it's also been the making of many individuals who had a dream, who had a passion, or simply had to change and discover, a talent for something. So yes, so you went from a consumer to you could argue the instigator of this business, but you're also a creator because you have really launched properly Podcastmate Radio, and you've got 2 series. Can you explain a bit more about that?
Yes. So Podcastmate Radio, the idea there is we want to be able to show people what we can do. And so that's the reason why we launched Podcastmate Radio. And then we have 2 verticals, which is PMR Amplify and PMR Diaries. So PMR Diaries is a narrative podcast, which is about my journey as an entrepreneur. PMR Amplify is more about getting experts who dominate in their industry, in their field, and like doing some interviews. But the style would be still kind of like narrative style because we want to try to avoid being like, similar to everyone else's podcast. So yeah, that's the idea. So there are 2 different audiences that we're trying to target on the same show.
So you just indicated that, you're doing it as a showcase of what's possible to maybe open the minds of your customers or, offer alternatives. So give us a quick description of what are you trying out? What are the kind of very daring elements, maybe of post-production you're doing on PMR?
So for example, for PMR Diaries, what I usually do is to make it more, I want to take them through my journey of what exactly is happening in my life as an entrepreneur, because this is my first entrepreneurial gig. So the idea there is as a narrative podcast about my adventures as an entrepreneur, the highs and lows that come along with it. Now, when we started that, I would usually record an audio journal. I journal a lot just because I need an outlet to express myself. So I either journal or write, but I journal a lot. So we used one of a lot of my audio journals to put the story together. And then our audio editor or podcast producer, he just like inserts, I don't know how he does his magic. The technical stuff, I don't know how he does his magic. But if you listen to it, you feel like it's kind of like a vlog, but an audio. So that's not easy. Like, how are you able to tell a story and bring people through your experience, bring people in that experience and make them feel that they're actually part of it through audio? So that was the challenge, and that was the goal, to make people see that no, there is not one way to produce a podcast. There's a lot of ways. If you're creative, if you actually really sit down and try to use your imagination, that, hey, doesn't have to be just like edit, take out the take out like all the noise and stuff. You can be creative. And how are you going to do that? How are you going to showcase that through a podcast? So that was kind of the idea.
And you've done so very successfully, I might add, because I discovered, obviously, your team and your services via a mutual friend, Richard Tubb. And when I listened to the interviews, I recognized this idea of creating an experience. I felt as though I was listening to something that could have been a video, if that makes any sense, where there was a lot of thought that gone behind it, a lot of ways in which you could use different segments and create different scenes almost, but it was only audio. And I thought that was remarkable. And I thought, I've got to talk to this lady, because it feels something that people should pay attention to. Because whereas in the UK in particular, podcasting has had a renaissance for the last 2 years, it does feel very, very similar. Whereas if you were to write, for example, everybody's got a very unique writing style. If you were to do video production, most people have very different visual kind of storytelling. With audio, it feels a bit repetitive until people like Podcastmate, you and your colleagues come along. Can I ask you a question then? On your website, and indeed the services you provide, you make the reference to branded podcast. And I just wanted to ask, I'm curious, what do you mean by branded podcast? What is it, and perhaps what is it not?
Okay, so in Podcastmate, we're a boutique podcast production company. We work with podcast or media companies who need like specialists, who needs like someone, or like companies who has like a very particular style that they need to be done. And that's where I come in. So our tagline is, we produce podcasts for iconic brands and market leaders. So in line with that, then the only podcast we produce is branded podcast. So branded podcast is a podcast that's produced by brands. For example, there's a lot of companies now who are producing their own podcasts. There's a way for them. It's like their content marketing strategy. So the idea there is to, instead of doing ads, they can, like these companies, they can spend their money doing ads, inserting their ads in established podcast. That's the path to least resistance. That's an easier way to do it. But if you're serious about really going out there and establishing yourself as an authority in your industry, and really be able to get your audience, or this market that you're trying to engage in them, make them see who you really are, what your values are as a company, make them feel like you're an approachable brand. Producing a branded podcast, I think, to me, is the best way to do it. A lot of branded podcasts right now, they don't, for example, let's see, Reminder Media, one of our clients, Reminder Media, they have a podcast called Stay Paid, sales and marketing podcast. So they are a media company themselves for real estate agents. They publish magazines and stuff. However, they also do this podcast where they bring in experts in sales or real estate and stuff like that. So their goal is to be able to deliver value to their audience who can be their potential. It's more like a lead generation approach. So, but they're delivering value. They're not just like, producing ads, which is people don't want to be sold to. They want you to deliver value first. So it's more subliminal instead of shouting that, hey, buy from me, buy from me.
And I think that's where, on occasion, some brands got a little confused or misinformed. Podcasting, which is part of the family of content marketing, is not the same as advertising. So I've had conversations in the past, perhaps you have as well, where people come to you and say, I need to sell more of this. And I've heard podcasting is good. I say, well, podcasting is amazing. But if you want to sell, or if you want to have a direct correlation between someone listening and someone buying, I think you may be overstretching, and actually completely missing the point of podcasting. Podcasting is about longevity. It's about establishing your brand in the marketplace, but creating, to use your term a moment ago, a more intimate relationship that would lead to someone actually then watching an ad with more goodwill and then potentially buying your services. And one thing that I suspect you must recommend your customers, this is also about, this is a long-term campaign. So we're not going to do, for example, 3 episodes and be done with it.
Yeah, podcasting is about playing the long game. This is not about running an ads on Facebook and expecting that you will get leads immediately. It's about establishing a relationship with your audience, taking them through the process of what must it feel like if I work with this company. How are they? What are their values? What kind of people do they have in their company? What kind of relationships do they have with each other? It's more human. And also, there are a lot of branded podcasts that are narrative. So it's not even interview podcasts. Like, you can use your imagination, and it's not limited to interview podcast. And there you could really see if they actually pay attention to their podcast. I'm sure if they pay attention to this tiny thing, which is just podcast, I'm sure they also pay attention to the service they give to their clients, because I always believe that how you do one thing is how you do everything. So yeah, that's kind of the idea.
I love that. As you do one thing is how you do everything. It's true. I work a lot in and around websites. I recommend customers about how to improve the impact of their website. And I say to them, you must understand that the website is a representation of how you do business. So if it's neglected, if it's out of date, if it's a little, kind of formal and pompous, whatever, people will take away that this is how you do business. And I think with podcast and you're out with voice, to hear from potentially, the decision makers, to hear from the customer facing personnel and understand more about their humanity and how they do what they do, I think it's just a very wonderful prospect for the customer.
Yeah, it's making a certain brand more human. Like GE, for example, they have their own podcast as well, branded podcast as well. And when you listen to the podcast, they're not even talking about their business. They're not talking about their business. And so you can see like, oh, they're not a one-dimensional company. They understand the human perspective, the human side of running business, and they're an established company. Why would they even do their own branded podcast? If they're doing a branded podcast, the question is, why aren't you?
Absolutely. So, well, let me use that as a segue into my first kind of practical question for this conversation. How would you help somebody who is new to podcasting, so that they have a brand, they're doing all the right things, and they just either are far too modest about, the positive impact they can have to the world, or they just would say to you, I just don't even know what we would talk about. How would you help somebody come up with ideas for their podcast?
Number one question is, I'm going to ask them, are you sure about this? Because this is number one, it's hard work. Number two, it's playing the long game. Number three, you never know when the end is. And number four, no one's going to tap you in the back and say that you did a good job. Like it's going to take a long while. And so I want to see if you actually have the mental fortitude to be able to do this long term, because if not, like, I don't want to waste my time, and I'm usually upfront, because number two, let's say they say yes to everything. Okay, let's get started. It's going to be more like an existential journey. If I'm talking to the founder or the the marketing director, for example, it's going to be, we usually have a questionnaire, so that can really sit and and contemplate on what is it really that you want to, what is the value that you want to give through the podcast? What kind of experience do you want your audience to have through this podcast? And aside from that, is like, once you have a podcast, where are you going to distribute this? Because it also matters. It's not just about producing the actual podcast, publishing it, and it's done. Produce the next episode, it's done. It's not like that. You want to make sure that you actually lengthen the life of one episode by repurposing the content and distribute it to different platforms and bring them back to your actual podcast, because the actual podcast or the actual episode is the long form content.
When people, because I get that a lot, to say, they can get their head around the mechanics and the step-by-step guide and so on, but they're still going to say, I have no idea what to talk about. Or they could say, if I talk about blogging, they'll say, I have no idea what I'm going to write about. I've got no idea what I'm going to do a video about. And I'm sure you do, help them reconnect with what they stand for as a brand in the marketplace. So yes, they're there to sell products and services, they're there to make profit and so on. But what is their contribution to a wider cause? What are they there to do? And as soon as you do that, you can see the kind of the line coming on a bit. Have you had some experience of making people quite surprised actually about how powerful and impactful their podcast was going to become?
They're surprised after they got the idea of what to produce.
Yeah, so sometimes, they'll start by being a little nervous, a little modest. And then once it starts, they realize, actually, we can talk about a lot, or we can, have an impact.
I've had an experience. I used to work for a tech company called SimpleSat, and I was a marketing director for that company while I was having Podcastmate. And so, of course, as someone who is a podcaster, like, wait, we need to have a company podcast. We need to have a branded podcast. This is perfect for business development. We can get other people who are potential partners, interview them in our show, and then we can have like really good relationship. It's like marketing each other as well. And so at first, I was working with a founder. Nestor was like, "Oh, how are we gonna do this?" I was like, "No, hang on. Let me handle this. I'll give you a questionnaire. Just think about these things, and then once I'll put it together and I'll propose like pitch ideas to you." And so that's usually how it starts. Like, I'll give them a questionnaire that they can think about. I'll pitch ideas, and then we keep on working on the idea until it crystallizes, and then bam, like it happens, and they're quite surprised that they actually were able to do it. It was like, it was fun. Like, I'm glad you had fun. That was the main thing. That was the main idea, to take you on a journey that's actually fun. It's going to scare you a little bit, but at the sweet spot of getting scared but having fun, like this exhilarating journey.
Yeah, and I've had the same reaction whether people want to write for the web or they want to do video. It's back to this idea of modesty, but also on occasion people would overcomplicate things in our own heads, and then I must say as well, the name is perfect. Podcastmate can really take them step by step and support them along the way. So with that in mind, can you just give us an overview? Because if I go on your website, by the way, pretty amazing everything that you do. So you've got podcast consultation, you've got show conceptualization and storyboarding, you've got podcast launch planning and execution, artwork design and branding, you've got sound design and audio editing, just brilliant, art direction, marketing direction, and content repurposing. So it's all there, frankly, and implicitly, as we mentioned a moment ago, building confidence and making people connect with their stories. So can you take me through the steps almost, if you can, of, right, I've just recorded something thanks to you and I feel great about it. What happens next with Podcastmate?
Once we have the raw file, and then it goes through Podcastmate, we're talking about post-production.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So once it goes through Podcastmate, then first thing we do is depending on if it is a narrative podcast, there's a lot of back and forth. But let's say it's just a simple podcast and we have like the full authority of doing our magic, then it's perfect. I like it better. So yeah, it goes through first as our audio or our post podcast producer will clean it and stuff like that. How do I explain this? It goes through our producers, usually video and podcast producers. They will do their magic, and then after that, they will actually for content repurposing. That's where it takes more time because I would actually sit down and listen to the episode over and over, not over and over, like really sit down and find like snippets or sound bites that I know has a lot of value. We will extract it. And then we have like probably like 10 snippets where we will do it as an audiogram or video snippets or like post quotes, stuff like that, and ensure that it's also in different sizes, like portrait size or square for Instagram, so that once we deliver it to the company, then they have everything they need to promote their podcast. So they have like the full fully produced episode and all the micro contents that they can share everywhere.
Can I just quickly pick on something you mentioned? Because our listeners or viewers could be wondering, you are clearly making a difference between, let's call it a normal podcast, because I can't think of another term, and a narrative podcast. Can we explore that a bit further? Where is the difference and how does it sound different to you?
Okay. So for the narrative podcast, usually we start with a blueprint. So we already run the story. There is already a story. They're like every single minute. Not every single minute, I'm exaggerating. But there's kind of like the outline of the story, right? And then also like the links to the file. So it's quite complicated, but we look at everyone in the team looks at one file, like the production manager, the podcast producer, the video producer, our designer who designs all these audiograms and stuff. So we look at all this one episode. And then, for example, let's say our director, creative director for the actual podcast would say, oh, let's say the entire one episode is already produced like on the first draft. And then the director would listen to it. And then they say like, oh, on this timestamp 0.1, la, 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 we need to have like a nice background music or make it like pop, make this word pop, something like all the tiny things that people won't think about, but it accumulates. That's the reason why when you sit and listen to it, you feel like you're there. Or you would listen to a narrative podcast, and let's say one of my episodes in PMR Diaries, I was like having an audio journal, and it sounded like I was in a cafe. I was at a cafe and doing recording my audio journal on my phone and thinking about like stuff like that, or there was traffic in the background. So all these tiny things, we capture it. That's kind of like the second layer of the podcast production. And then we keep polishing from there. It would usually take 4 runs until we say, okay, we're ready to publish this.
Yeah. And I had the pleasure of listening to one of your narrative podcasts, and the immersion is quite significant. You know, there's different ways. I mean, today we are recording, let's call it a linear podcast, because it is about learning, it's about taking actions, and we're going to stick with that formula. But then, you know, when you have the next evolution up, which is a narrative podcast, there's 2 things that remind me a bit of back in the days of learning a foreign language, when they were adding music and other things to make you remember the, you know, what you were learning. But also back to this idea of, oh my goodness, well, if you've taken that amount of care into the production, my feelings and goodwill towards your brand would be even greater. And I think there's definitely a correlation between time and effort in the audio production and how the audience feels in general, because this is how I'm being looked after.
Yes. That is so true, because we really like our promise to our clients is we do the heavy lifting for you so you don't have to. All you got to do is press record. So that's our promise. And if we tell you all you got to do is press record, I guarantee you all you got to do is press record. You won't even think, you won't even notice. It's about like, you won't even notice that there was actually a problem, because we already took that problem away. Like, we make it go away before you realize that there was a problem. We already anticipated that that's going to happen. So all these tiny things that you won't realize that you actually have to deal with if you did it on your own. So when working, I'm going to brag a little bit right now.
You should.
But when working with us, it's like, our goal is to be partners with our clients, not just producers. It's like, you can tell me exactly what kind of feel you want, how you want your audience to feel. It's all about feelings. That's why also our kind of like the vibe that we're going for is nostalgia marketing. We're like retro and stuff, because we want to make people feel that if we actually took the time to produce everything together, where when you go to our website, you feel like you're transported in a different era. Can you imagine what else we would do if if we're the ones producing your podcast? We will take your audience to a different era. We will take your audience into a different feel. Every single thing we will take care of, so that they would really feel that they're there. It's experiential. And so if that is like your content marketing strategy, which is, let's say, a narrative podcast or something like that, that would, it's kind of like evoking these certain feelings, right? And when you tap to your audience through emotions, it's more subliminal. They have like a certain connection, like a much deeper connection, where it'd be like, oh, and I was listening to this podcast, it made me feel like I can trust them. It made me feel like they will listen to me. Oh, I want to work with them. Like, let's see how they're gonna, like, can you imagine what kind of connection, or how will they take care of me? Like, like stuff like that. If you're a brand, or if whatever. And you don't need to, because currently the problem is, or the main challenge is, the reason why Podcastmate exists is because almost everyone is starting a podcast. All companies are starting a podcast, let's just say. But do you really want to spend the time to build or assemble your own podcasting team to produce this podcast? Do you really have the time to train them, to make them up to the level where they can, or they're able to produce a podcast that's really, really good, that would communicate the value of your company? Do you really want to do that? I don't know. Maybe you do. If you don't, then that's where we come in.
Excellent. And I think people listening to this will appreciate, it's not just that you take care of the heavy lifting and remove some of the annoying bits that may come with media production. It's because that's your day job. You know what's working, you know what's not working, can give advice based on previous kind of iterations. But also, I suspect you also keep track of trends, you keep track of what's coming soon and that kind of thing. So I want to use that as a bit of a segue into the future of podcasting, as far as you sense it, because we don't have hard data, as in, I can't predict the future so much. But when you look at the work you've done so far, when you look at what's happening out there, where do you think we're going in the next 2 to 3 years, potentially, with audio production?
I feel like, because somehow narrative podcasting is somehow it's gaining traction. The thing is, it takes a long time to produce. It takes careful attention. But I feel like in terms of podcasting, we're just getting started. Because of the pandemic, I feel like that's the reason why podcasting is gaining traction right now, because of the pandemic, because we need more content to consume to keep us occupied, to aside from just video or reading and stuff like that. Now, in terms of like where we are in the podcast production, I think we're just getting started. I think people are just like learning about different styles of how to produce a podcast, because people only know about interview style podcasts, which is one way, which is plain. Now, right now, there are a lot of podcast awards already. I forgot the latest one, but there's the last one we saw was actually a British podcast award, and that's where we saw like a lot of companies who are also doing narrative podcasts. For example, QR Media, which is one of our inspirations. So we were listening to the podcast, to the show that won, and I'm like, wow, I thought we were immersive. This is immersive.
Yeah.
And they would even say, like, if you're driving a car, because it was about like driving, like stuff. Like it was a really nice story. It's like a movie. It's like a movie, but in a podcast. And they would warn, like, if you're driving, don't listen to this podcast because it's immersive. So I think we're just getting started. I think it's going to get better and better. And I think narrative podcast is going to gain traction, just like vlogs is so in these days. People like to follow people's journey because it's more real. Like, we're done with all these commercials and ads, and people pretend, I don't know, like unreal things, right? With narrative, it's more realistic, it's human, and all the other things, a lot of other things, machines can do. So now, like creativity, for example, is it's a premium, how do you call it? It's premium now. Creativity is premium. People will pay for creativity if you can think outside of the box. Like, people can do that with narrative podcasts. That's where you can really express fully. Yeah.
No,
I'm not sure if I answered your question. But.
No, you have. And I think back to your point about creativity, I remind myself that, of course, that's what people used to pay for, oddly, before the internet. And something has happened when people were able to have their own laptops and go online and so on, where they felt empowered to do a lot of things themselves. But there's a limit. And I think what people should do is certainly have a foray into podcasting, perhaps themselves, and try something and realize if it's for you, build a team, find a way to get additional support. Because interestingly, tomorrow I'm delivering a presentation on imagination, because I think when it's all said and done, people will work their way around the tech. They will learn which microphone works for them. They will learn how to edit. They can do all the mechanical stuff. But the reason why your podcast or your article or your video is going to do a bit better than the others is down to your imagination. And that is a talent or a skill, if you want to use that term, that has to be nurtured. And there's different ways which you can do that. So, yeah, I would agree with you, which is now that it's almost like the way the web has evolved. Now that we understand the mechanics, can we go back to creativity? Can we go back to finding your voice, the styles and so on, so that we avoid a situation, if I use once again the example of websites, where there was a time where all websites looked the same. There was a time where all websites had the same menu, the same images, you know what I mean? Like the same words.
Yes. The same words. I'm like, can't you think of other things than using menu or home or like about? There's so many words. Why is everyone using the same words? Who's making these rules?
Yeah, absolutely. Listen, Nash, incredibly, our time together is pretty much coming to an end. It's gone so fast. They always do those conversations. But I think, before I let you go, I would like you to take part in a fun quiz. Well, I say fun, it is fun for me, but you'll tell me afterwards if you've enjoyed it. But, once again, thank you so much for sharing, your story to date and your reflection on podcasting and how to engage an audience. But let's begin with question number one. If you could have a video call with a celebrity, perhaps from the world of business or entertainment, who would it be?
Seth Godin.
Right. Interesting. Yeah. What a guy.
Should I share why?
Yeah, please. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So I didn't know if I had to explain. definitely Seth Godin. I feel like he's everything he says is sage. Everything, like how I think in terms of marketing is highly, highly influenced by Seth. And why I like how he thinks, what his perspective in marketing is very human. He even talks about people when we do like marketing stuff. It's about, find the demographics. But he thinks about psychographics. And because my background is psychology, I finished psychology in uni. And so like, that's the reason why I talk a lot about like no experience, like feelings and stuff. And this is how Seth Godin's take about a lot of things is human. It's not numbers. It's not like, it's not like about rules and stuff, which is very business. No, like, yeah, I think I'm not going to elaborate much further, but you agree. What do you think?
I would agree. He was the first one really in the 90s and 2000s to call out the BS, that came out of digital marketing, people worrying about all the wrong things and everything that goes out there. Fine choice. Now, it can't be just about work, of course, Nash. So if you could organize your own online concert for you and your family, which artist or band would play for you?
Online concert. This is a tough one. I need to check my Spotify playlist. Who have I been listening lately? I think Maggie Rogers.
Right.
I like her style. I like her music. It's a mix of retro country, and it's also very, it's like kind of like a reflection of her life, and she writes it into a music. So it's more real than just like kind of like how music are these days where there is no soul. I like to listen to songs that has an actual story based on their life and the artist actually really putting it together, having this careful thought about every single thing, and think about every single thing. I appreciate like stuff like that because I think about those things a lot.
No, you're absolutely right. It is about the effort you go in. People respect that. So whilst you're listening to this and watching and probably dancing to this online concert, what food would you order for you and your family?
Falafel and hummus. That's my go-to for everything. I always order falafel. I think it pleases everyone. Because I'm vegetarian also. And it's so good.
It is good. It is very good. So this is an interesting question for you, actually. So these are the same question I ask all my guests, but for you, if you could have your own radio show, what would you talk about and who would be your co-host?
I already have a radio show, but I have another podcast, actually. It's called Chasing Flow State. It's more about, because I'm into peak performance, flow. As a rock climber, a yoga teacher as well, I am into stuff like this. So if this is kind of like a dream radio show and I could choose whoever co-host I would have, I definitely would like to have Stephen Kotler. He's like the main researcher now about flow state. Okay. And he researches a lot about peak performance and skateboarding and rock climbing and surfing. So we're just going to talk all about peak performance, biohacking, all these good stuff.
Super. Final question for you as part of the Content Marketing Studio quiz.
Okay.
When we can, and soon, travel again, where would you like to go? Is there anywhere in the world you've not been yet?
Yes, I want to go to Spain and spend 3 months rock climbing.
Where would you go in Spain for rock climbing?
Say what?
Where would you go? Is there a particular part of Spain good for rock climbing?
There is a very specific place called Marialef, where a lot of the best climbers in the world go to. So I would like to go there, but when I need to train harder so that I could climb those routes, because much harder for me, way much harder for where I am right now.
Excellent. Well, listen, Nash, once again, thank you so much for taking part in the Content Marketing Studio and sharing your understanding and wisdom when it comes to podcasting and being really a source of inspiration for our viewers and listeners to find your voice, find your style, and commit to it. You will find your audience, and the audience will find you. Big thank you for you, viewers and listeners. Thank you for your support. Until the next one, go out there and make sure your content is better and faster. Bye for now.